Thanks, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you've had a great couple of days. I thought the John Hattie presentation this morning was just fantastic. As Matthew said, I'm the commentary editor of Education Week, and I'm sure you all are eager to get to your networking lunch, but we've got one more surprise for you, or maybe not such a surprise, which is Peter DeWitt. And we're really excited to give you a sneak preview of what he's going to present next year at Leaders. It gives me great privilege to welcome Peter to the stage. He and I have worked closely together for about 7 years. Peter, as many of you may know, is a former classroom teacher, middle school principal, and the author of 5 books. He also pens the popular Ed Week blog, Finding Common Ground, where more than 1 million people a year follow him on topics such as school climate, leadership, and student engagement. Obviously, these are big, important concerns for everyone in the field today. So this morning, as I said, we all heard from John Hattie on visible learning, this idea that seeing learning through the eyes of the student is really what matters. And Peter's work builds on John's. If John is the researcher, Peter really is the practitioner. He travels the country, now the world, coaching districts at every level. And we're lucky to have him here today for our sneak preview, so I'm not going to take up any more of your time, but welcome Peter to the stage.
Oh my gosh, you came back. I told Elizabeth, I said, are you sure people are actually going to come back, or are they just going to head out because it's a nice day? And most of us who live at least in the Northeast or the Midwest have experienced snow from last September through probably June. So I'm intimidated to be here for 2 reasons. Number one is I'm with leaders to learn from. And that's a pretty intimidating crowd to actually be speaking in front of. The second reason why I'm intimidated is because I stand between you and lunch. So I'm going to make this relatively painless and a little bit quick, but the good thing is, and I'm thankful that Matthew and Elizabeth asked me to matter most. I published this with Corwin Press a couple of years ago. And one of the reasons why I started writing the book in the first place is because I was working with a lot of school districts on John's work, and people kept coming back saying, so where do I start, where do I start, where do I start? And as Elizabeth said, I'm a practitioner, and I feel like I love John's research, and as we know, it is vast. We're talking 300 million students. We're talking 90,000 research articles. There's a huge database. And for me, I always need to know where the starting point is, because if I look at it all, I'm going to get lost in that. So I really tried to choose 6 influences that matter most. But one of the things that I started to notice, which was very interesting, is that when I was starting to work with school districts, they were saying these things about John's research that just wasn't true. And the hard part about being in education is that we sometimes go after the shiny new toy because that's the next thing coming. We're dealing with mandates, we're dealing with accountability from the national and the state level. And then we see something like John's research come by, and we hurry up and we try to grab it. And I've had people say, well, I read Visible Learning, we did a book study, so now we're a visible learning school. I've been working with John for 4.5 years. I break his work down to 1,000 words or less for the blog. I talk to him almost every single week. We present together. And I still feel like when I'm sitting in the room, I'm looking up and I'm learning new things about John's research. One of the other things that happened to me one time was I was in this state and I was working with a specific school district. And what we know about John's research is that a 0.40 equates to a year's worth of growth for a year's input. We call that the Hinge Point. And there are influences all over the place. John has about 251 influences now, which has grown from 138 back in 2009. But one time I was working with a school district and I had mentioned some influences that would be beneficial. And one of the assistant superintendents came up to me and they said, we're kind of hoping you're not going to talk about some of these influences that are below a 0.60. And I was like, why? If we know that 0.40 is the hinge point, and even John will tell you that there are other influences that are below that hinge point that are worthy of carrying out, things like project-based learning, which has a 0.26 effect size. But they said, well, if a 0.40 equates to a year's worth of growth, then a 0.60 is better. We need to get rid of anything under a 0.60. So I showed them the effect size for school leadership, which is a 0.33. And it was a little awkward at first, because I'm like, do you really need to kind of get rid of this one? And that's the thing. So raise your hand if you are school leaders. 0.33, you were almost effective. Now, maybe not just you, because you're leaders to learn from, so you're probably on the other end. But what happens sometimes is we do that to research, right? One of the things that we can learn from John, and I learned from doing school climate work and leadership work, is, Howard Gardner, he had to clarify multiple intelligences because he found out that teachers and leaders were telling kids that they were kinesthetic learners, and that's it. And then we had Carol Dweck. I was lucky enough to write a blog a few years ago based on John's research called Why the Growth Mindset Won't Work. And Carol ended up writing sort of a clarification for Ed Week a couple of months later, because what she found is that we were all looking at kids saying, you need to have a growth mindset, but we were treating them in very fixed ways. The same thing happens with John. He mentioned class size today. There are certain things that his research shows that we go for the surface level view and then we just grab it and go. The problem is, when we go back into our schools to do some of this work, we wonder why there's an implementation dip. We wonder why the initiative doesn't always work. And the reality is, it's a school climate issue too. Because we can look at the most wonderful things during our summer meeting plans and our admin team meetings. But what's going to happen in January, after people are tired? Is the implementation still going to be worthwhile? And if we haven't used a common language, which is one of the most beneficial things that we can use in schools, especially when we're doing implementation, is that we need to be able to use a common language. And if we haven't used that, if people don't have an understanding of this piece of research, then your initiative is at risk of failing. So when I was working with school districts, I started to kind of look at the research and say, which ones really matter to me? Now, I had taken a leave of absence to start working with John. And so I had a 6-month leave of absence. And during that time, I really wanted to get a chance to understand his research. But as Elizabeth said, I'm always going to have the practitioner mindset. It's because I was a building leader. It's because I was a teacher. But also even with the blog, the Finding Common Ground blog for Ed Week, I always try to write something 1,100 words or less that you can read today and put into practice tomorrow, because sometimes what happens is we get so caught up in the research that we don't always know the practical pieces to put into place. So, with John's research, we know that there are over 1,400 meta-analysis, 300 million students, and we've got that 0.40. The fun thing about working with John is that we were presenting together last year at Hofstra University, and I had 195 influences on my screen that I was ready to be able to talk about some of them when I was going to get up on stage in 15 minutes right after him. And then he said, I have 251 influences on learning. I'm like, great. And I had to change things within that 15 minutes. So John's research is always evolving. And what you need to understand too is that when you're looking at these influences, when you're looking at the effect size, you have to keep in mind that it is an average effect size of the meta-analysis that he had collected. So there were 6 that I chose. Number 1 was instructional leadership. And next year, when I come back to do the keynote, we're going to dive deeper into this. But I saw some of you have the collaborative leadership book, and I talk about this in the blog as well. Instructional leadership is really necessary. John talked about moderators this morning. When you look at school leadership as a whole, it has that 0.33. But for instructional leadership, it has a 0.42. We need to focus on instructional leadership. It doesn't mean we can't be managers from time to time, But the reality is, I work with a lot of school leaders that walk into classrooms twice a year to do teacher observations, and they have zero credibility to give the feedback they're trying to give to teachers because they just don't go into classes. Part of what's working against that is what we as leaders think is our mindset. So what I would like you to do is stand up if when you were entering into leadership, somebody looked at you and said, oh, you're going to the dark side. Stand up. I believe that saying we went to the dark side is one of the most devastating things we can do to leaders. Thank you for standing up. Because I don't think leadership is about the dark side. I think leadership is about working collaboratively with a lot of different stakeholders and getting to know them over the years, getting to know their siblings, getting to know families. So instructional leadership is one of those important pieces because we have to be in the classroom to be able to understand what's going on in the classroom. We have to, at our faculty meetings and department meetings, we have to be able to focus on instructional strategies. John wrote a great paper 4 years ago called The Politics of Distraction. And in that he says we need to change the narrative. We need to stop talking about teaching so much, and we need to talk about learning. That's what instructional leaders do. My question to you is, how do you position yourself as an instructional leader? I was in classrooms every single day. I went to every classroom every morning to say good morning to my students. Now, it was easier for me because I had 400 students in the elementary school, but they would call it my morning rounds. It was one of the favorite parts of my day. And then I would go back in. And sometimes I could make it to grade levels, sometimes through the whole building, other times just to one class. But I really got an understanding of what was going into classes. That positioned me as an instructional leader. Not because I necessarily had that I wanted to be able to do. It was because I wanted to understand where teachers were coming from, and I missed being in the classroom. I flipped my faculty meetings, which meant that we co-constructed a goal, and then I would find a resource or two to send out to teachers ahead of time, 3 days before the faculty meeting, so they could get surface level understanding of what it is we were going to focus on. Because see, sometimes you are talking about things that you have a great deal of research behind you. You've been focusing on this with admin teams, but the problem is we go back to our teachers and we treat them like they're supposed to be in a place we want them to be as opposed to being where they really are. And we need to understand that because if we're not using that common language, the initiative is going to fall. Number 2 is collective teacher efficacy, and this is something that John introduced as the number 1 a couple of years ago. And it's not as simple as getting teachers to work together. It's more complicated than that because we're talking about school climate. We're talking about how much of a voice did teachers have in your stakeholder groups before you dropped this idea of collective teacher efficacy. The important thing about collective teacher efficacy is not only that it has a huge effect size, but we as leaders think that we're supposed to know it all when we go into our leadership experience, and we can't. You are asked to do too much, and you don't know it all, nor should you be expected to. I remember I emailed Ken Leithwood because I was going to be doing some work with the Ontario Principals Council. And when I emailed Ken Leithwood, I said, as a leader, wouldn't you have to have a high level of self-efficacy in order to build collective efficacy? And he said, no, that's the beauty of it. You can go in not totally having that belief, but if you've got the right people around you, you can learn from them, and that will raise your self-efficacy. Collective efficacy is all about what is the problem of practice that you need to focus on, and John said it this morning. It's about collecting evidence and using that evidence to see your impact where collective efficacy is concerned. Part of the collaborative leadership work I do has been adopted at the state level and the university level. I teach a wonderful cohort leadership program called Moving Up at the University of Oklahoma, where I spend 5 sessions with amazing leaders from around Oklahoma. But every time we meet, they have to bring evidence based in one of the influence that we were just learning about. That evidence collection is really, really important. Then we've got professional development. I like to consider it professional learning and development now. It's based on some work from Andy Hargraves and Michael Folan, where professional learning is about when we get together with the staff and we're looking for outcomes. But professional development is focusing on mindfulness. You know, it's really hard to be in schools. We have a lot of kids who are suffering from trauma. And what we know from the trauma research is we suffer from vicarious trauma as adults because we want to take them home. Well, professional development is really important because we have to develop that mindfulness with our staff. There are certain social emotional issues that we go through as a staff that we aren't always the experts in. So we need to work with outside agencies. That's a professional development issue. Number 4 on the list is feedback, and I've always been a big fan of feedback, but I have to be honest with you. I started looking at feedback back in 2012 because the September 2012 issue of ACD's Educational Leadership was about feedback. John had an article in there. The late Grant Wiggins had an article in there. I realized that I spent a lot of time giving praise to my teachers, and I didn't always give them feedback. So John looks at feedback from an instructional mindset. He's got task, process, and self-regulation. That's the instructional levels of feedback. I write about that in collaborative leadership and school climate as well, but some important information that I've learned over the past couple of years comes from Stone and Heen. How many of you have read the book, Thanks for the Feedback? It is one of the most important books that I have read in many years because what Stone and Heen say, they're out of Harvard Law School, what Stone and Heen found is that we have feedback triggers. So when somebody gives us feedback, even though we're seeking feedback, there's a feedback trigger that goes off for us. One is the identity trigger, because the feedback we get shatters the identity we have for ourselves. Feedback is so much more complicated, and one of the mistakes that I've seen school leaders do is that they'll go through and they'll do walkthroughs and they'll leave that feedback sheet behind. The problem is the teacher never had a voice in the process. So feedback was done to them as opposed to being done with them. I think if we really want to explore feedback in our schools, we have to not only understand instructional feedback in those pieces, but we have to understand the work of Stone and Heen and those feedback triggers. Assessment-capable learners is number 5. And this was always, for many years, this was actually John's number 1 influence. Assessment-capable learners, especially this week as I know our states are dealing with state testing, many people think John only wants kids to do well on assessments. That's not what assessment-capable learners are. Assessment-capable learners are students that know where they are in the learning process, they know how they got there, and they know where they're going to next. But in order to delve into assessment-capable learners, something that I do often, and I will do next year as well, is we need to look at the social-emotional learning piece and the academic learning piece. They're both equally as important. And it's funny because when I write about social-emotional learning for my blog, I get major pushback from people that say, you should not be focusing on social-emotional learning. Schools are not the place for social-emotional learning. You are making our boys wimpy. I've actually had people say that. And I'm thinking, wow, I didn't realize, somebody actually called me a lefty liberal who is trying to brainwash children. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting. I thought I was just teaching kids how to be nice to each other and collaborate. But, you know, there's that. The interesting thing about assessment-capable learners is that sometimes we really have to look at not just the strategies, John talked about that this morning, but the impact that we're having. You know, one of the interesting criticisms of John's work is sometimes these large effect sizes. I've had people contact me and say, 1.44, that's more than 3 years worth of growth. Wow, we should be doing that with everyone. And I'm like, you know, we should actually. And they come off sarcastic saying, well, how do you do that? I'm like, well, it's about what's the impact? What are the teachers looking at? Are they changing strategies? Are they using formative assessment? Do they understand cultural nuances? Do they understand how to teach minoritized populations? But let me give you a personal story about assessment-capable learners, and I'll talk about the 3 years worth of growth. So I'm with the leaders to learn from, but I will tell you that I'm the youngest of 5 kids. I was retained in 4th grade. My dad died when I was in 5th grade. My mom went back to get her GED when I was in 6th grade. I was a sub-sophomore when I was in high school because I didn't have enough credits to be a full-fledged sophomore. And then I started long-distance running, and my coaches, we worked really hard, but we set the bar kind of low. It was, Pete, just graduate from high school. Because I'll tell you, that was a challenge. And I did graduate from high school. I graduated ranked 262 out of 266. I was fourth from last in my class. Now, I know that Matthew is probably wondering, really? We had Angela Duckworth, Carol Dweck, John Hattie, and maybe we should look for number 260 out of 266. But I failed out of 2 community colleges, and on my last attempt, it was really my last attempt, my sister Trish said, I just want you to have more than you have right now. So I went to Hudson Valley Community College, and in comes Ron Molson, my coach, and he said, DeWitt, you're not going to be a professional runner, you need to go into the Learning Assistance Center. So I walked in with a 1.7 GPA, and that semester I walked out with a 3.86, and I now have 2 master's degrees and a doctorate. So this is the thing. Do I think you can get 3 years growth out of kids? I can. I do. I think that if you're really leaders to learn from, you have that kind of impact on students. And we shouldn't let a big number lead us to some sarcastic comment, because the reality is you can have that big of an impact. But the last influence is also really important, and I was glad that the team yesterday afternoon did an outstanding job talking about family engagement. Too often what we do is we talk at families, we don't talk with them. We share our message, which, don't get me wrong, that's really important. They need to know what's going on in school. But even John taught me a little bit about this as well, but I worked in some high poverty city schools, so I knew this too, is that sometimes we use educational leads and acronyms, and we lose the parents as soon as we do that because they don't understand what it is we're talking about, and they're too afraid to tell you that. So instead of telling you they don't understand what you're talking about, they just don't come back. Family engagement is really important. When I'm working with different organizations and different programs, what I found is that schools often communicate in 3 ways when it comes to families. One is monologue. This is what you need to know. These are important dates. This is when parent-teacher conferences. This is when open houses. All really important. But then there's dialogue. The team yesterday was talking about dialogue, where it was, we go to them. We talk with them. We understand where they are. And the last one's about learning. We focus on things like science fairs and math nights. They need to see what their kids are learning because in many cases, school has changed from when they were there. So that's it. These are the 6 influences that I think matter most. They've held up pretty well over the past few years. John seems to agree. He wrote the foreword to the book. I'm really honored to be asked to be with you today, but also to be with you next year as well. And I always love to have a level of transparency. My email address is up on the screen, and if you ever need anything, please know that you can always email me. But thank you, and now I'm going to have the scariest moment of it all. My fantastic editor, and I'm going to say this, I started writing for Ed Week 7 years ago, and writing for Education Week has absolutely changed my life because it connected me with an audience that I never would have had. And it has connected me with fantastic people, and one of those fantastic people is Elizabeth Rich, my editor.
So that was kind of exciting. I have never seen you do that before.
I know, kind of weird, huh?
We even color coordinated
Yeah.
today. So for those of you who have sharp eyes, you'll notice. So I wanted to talk to you more about the practical aspects of this. We visited a bit last night to talk about some of this work. And I'm thinking in terms of, you have a pretty favorable audience right now, but that's not always the case.
Right.
And I'm wondering, how do we bring people along? If it's about collective efficacy, and it's not about the politics of distraction, how do we get people into the fold to really buy into this idea?
I always look for the entry point. Like when I'm going to work with a group over a period of time, I always send out a pre-engagement survey with a few questions in there about collaboration and what do you want the presenter or facilitator to know about you? And that gives me good insight because people are very raw and they're very honest in that case. But the other thing that I learned, I used to train instructional coaches for Jim Knight, who's an instructional coaching expert. And Jim taught me a couple of very powerful words, and it was easy and powerful. Whatever we do needs to be easy enough to put into practice, but it needs to be powerful enough to change their practice. And I feel like as a consultant, and I'll tell you, when I was a school principal, I was very outspoken against state testing and those kind of things, and I wasn't very kind about consultants. and then I became one. So I think you have to be careful what happens. But I think the onus is on me when I walk into a setting like that is I need to be able to give you something that's going to be better than what you're already doing. And I think you need to be able to have that mindset too. Just because John Hattie says it doesn't mean that a teacher is going to fall on it and say this is the greatest thing ever. They really need to know, how is this going to benefit me? And you also have to keep in mind it's a self-efficacy issue. Sina and I were talking about self-efficacy earlier, and the thing about self-efficacy is that there are some people, teachers, whatever, that just don't necessarily know how to put into practice what you're asking them to do. And you need to understand that. And I think understanding that self-efficacy piece and looking for the entry point and understanding where they are and then giving them something more powerful are the ways to be able to do that.
Yeah, and to that point, you and John both offer a version of the statement, which is collaborative leadership is about working with all stakeholders to create and act on goals. And so last night, and you referenced it today too, this common language. So maybe you could just briefly go into, I don't know, some examples of what that might look like. Michelle Brooks talked about it yesterday in terms of family engagement.
Yeah, I think in some cases, what I did when I was a teacher in a high poverty school, I realized pretty early on that some parents just didn't like me, and it had nothing to do with me because they had never met me before. It really had to do with what I what I symbolized, right, as a teacher. So I think trying to be empathetic to them when they're coming in or going to them are some of the ways you do that. I think we tried to make a conscious effort not to always, and it sounds simple, but it's much harder to do, drop acronyms all the time. Yeah. Or, when you look at things like special ed meetings, you've got 8 or 10 professionals around the table and the parent's able to bring in one advocate. And it's like if I walked into my doctor's office and I saw 10 doctors in my office and they said, Peter, sit down, we need to talk, I think I was dying. So I think it's also about being present. It's about being on the sidewalk. It's about, bringing them in. It's about being there to listen to them when they need to talk to you. I feel like every time you have a conversation as a building administrator or district administrator, and you have lots of them, they're all very important times because they either build a bridge or build a wall. And I always wanted to make sure that families knew that I was understanding where they were coming from and I was trying to be empathetic to their needs. So those are some of the things. The other thing that I did was I talked about the flipped faculty meeting a little bit, which is really just about co-constructing a goal, sending an article out ahead of time around that goal, giving people time to spend a couple of days getting surface level knowledge, and then they bring evidence with them, and we dig down deep in a faculty meeting. Like, here is an article on feedback, and please bring examples of your feedback to the faculty meeting, and then we're going to share best practices, that kind of stuff. What became a model that I wanted to use with teachers became a model that I started to use with families because I realized that my newsletters were doing something awful. They were really pretty newsletters. In elementary school, we do that. But the problem is, we had a lot of pictures of the parents who were volunteering in school. So I was actually telling a certain part of my population that you stink as a parent because you can't come in to volunteer. And I realized there are parents that can't come in or family members that can't come in because they work 2 jobs or 3 jobs. So what I started to do, we had Edline, which was the parent portal at the time. I continued to do a 1-page newsletter. We called it the refrigerator page. And my secretary, Donna Nichols, and I hung it, they hung it up on the refrigerator. But then I started doing, like, this is the day in the life of a post and kill student. Or I actually did one before open house. It was 3 days before open house. And I said, you're going to meet with me for 30 minutes before you go to your child's teacher. And we're going to talk about the Common Core, which was brand new at that time, and Dignity for All Students Act, our anti-bullying legislation. And I sent it out, and I started hearing from parents within 30 minutes. And I'm telling you, at that open house, we had standing room only. And we didn't talk about the Common Core as much as we talked about what bullying is and what it's not. And that was a huge conversation to be able to have. And, like the team yesterday afternoon said, if you want parents to come, put out something controversial. Like if you send out a flipped communication 3 days before PTA to talk about this is the topic we're going to focus on, then you're probably going to have more families come. But the other thing to be careful of is, are you listening to them when they're coming? That listening piece is really important.
it's amazing how much of this work is really rooted in empathy, which is really
Yeah,
what good leadership at the end of the day is really all about, isn't it?
I was always a huge fan of Servant Leadership by Robert Greenleaf, came out in the 70s. And I always felt like my job was to serve the people around me. And I feel like that now with blogging and all of those kind of things. I feel like it's my job to really listen to where they are and see where I can fit in and help them. And you're right, I think empathy is a huge part. And listen, I remember what it was like to have my mom, the cafeteria lady. You know, my mom never remarried, and when after my dad died, so it was a lot of the, well, maybe they don't care about education because, you know, it's a one-parent household and all that kind of stuff. You know, from a school climate issue, there were never books that included a guy that, you know, lost his dad or something like that. So there are a lot of these symbols around that showed that my life was different. I think what I'm also trying to do is say, how are we going to be inclusive? How are we making sure that all of the populations that are within our schools actually feel included and supported?
Yeah, that's really great. We have about 47 seconds. So the one thing I do want to ask you, because you're now traveling, you told me, and also you told Scott Montgomery, our editor-in-chief, you're traveling 47 weeks out of the year. So in 35 seconds or less, can you tell us why is this work resonating so much?
I really don't know. No.
Okay, that's it, folks.
I told you I was going to say that. I don't know if it's, you know, through the nature of the blog, you know, the readership grew and people knew me that way. And then John Hattie's research is something people really want to know about, but it's huge. So I'm maybe able to explain it in a different way. And then, if anything, I'm just very practical because I care about helping you go from point A to point B and grow.
That's really great. Thank you so much for
Right,
coming
thank you for
and
having
speaking
me.
with us today. I'm going to also welcome Matthew back to the stage to give everybody their marching orders.
Is that what we're doing? Okay.
Everybody smile.
No, I don't care about that.
Thank you, everybody, for your time in the past 2 days, particularly your participation and your sharing with one another. It's critical to the value that you can get out of this experience that all those watching on the live stream could be getting if they were here today with you. We look forward to seeing the complete workshop with Peter next year. That will be happening here in Washington, D.C. For those on the live stream, I'm going to be saying goodbye to you now, so thank you very much. Take the time that you can to do your evals for us from what you've experienced on the live stream.